The call came in at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in September. Highway 34 eastbound, 2 miles past the grain elevator. A military transport semi carrying a decommissioned F-4 Phantom fighter jet had blown its drivetrain trying to climb the grade out of the valley. The truck was blocking both lanes. The jet weighed 11 tons, the trailer weighed another 14, and the entire rig was sitting at a 7% incline with no power, no brakes, and no way to move it without specialized equipment. The county dispatcher called everyone. 2 heavy-duty tow trucks arrived first. Both hooked up. Both failed. The weight distribution was wrong. The angle was wrong. The mud along the shoulder was soft from 3 days of rain, and every attempt to pull forward just dragged the tow trucks backward into the ditch. By 4 p.m., there were 6 vehicles on scene. Sheriff's deputies, a road crew, a county engineer, and a growing crowd of locals who'd heard about it on the scanner and driven out to watch. Nobody could move it. That's when Robert Callahan pulled his grain truck onto the shoulder, stepped out, and stared at the scene for a long time without saying a word. Robert was 73 years old. He'd been farming the same 840 acres his grandfather bought in 1948. He wore the same style of work boots he'd worn since 1971. He drove the same routes, he planted the same crops, and he kept the same equipment running long past the point when most men would have scrapped it, including a 1912 Massey Ferguson tractor that had been sitting in his equipment shed for the last 19 years. He walked up to the transport driver. "You got chains?" The driver looked at him like he'd asked if the jet could fly itself home. "Chains won't help. We need a rotator crane or a heavy wrecker. This thing's too big." Robert didn't argue. He just nodded, walked back to his truck, and made a call. 30 minutes later, his neighbor, a man named Eugene Tovey, pulled up in a flatbed hauling something under a tarp that looked like it had been dragged out of a museum. The crowd went quiet. Eugene climbed out, untied the straps, and pulled the tarp back. Underneath was a 1912 Massey Ferguson Model 2040 tractor. It was massive, 8 feet tall at the smokestack, 11,000 pounds of cast iron, steel, and brass. The flywheel alone weighed 900 pounds. The rear wheels stood taller than a man. The engine was a 4-cylinder kerosene burner with exposed valve springs and a hand-crank start system that looked like it belonged in a coal mine. It was painted red and black. The paint was original. The serial number was still visible on the frame, MF4021. It had been built in Toronto, Ontario in April of 1912. Shipped by rail to Fargo, North Dakota. Sold to a farmer named Edwin Callahan, Robert's grandfather, for $1,850, and it had been in the family ever since. Most people had forgotten it existed. Robert hadn't. He'd spent 2 decades restoring it, piece by piece, bearing by bearing. He'd rebuilt the engine 3 times. He'd hand-filed new piston rings. He'd recast broken gears in his own forge. He'd learned to mix his own Babbitt metal for the crankshaft bearings because nobody made them anymore. Everyone told him it was a waste of time. His son told him to scrap it and buy a modern tractor. His wife told him to sell it to a museum. His neighbors called it Robert's retirement project, in a tone that made it clear they thought he'd lost his mind. But Robert kept working, because that tractor had pulled his family through the Dust Bowl. It had plowed fields when his father couldn't afford fuel for anything else. It had hauled grain wagons during the war when steel was rationed and new equipment didn't exist. And Robert believed it still had work to do. Now, standing on the side of Highway 34 with a fighter jet stuck on a trailer and a crowd of people staring at him like he'd brought a cannon to a car accident, he was about to find out if he was right. Eugene backed the flatbed up to the shoulder. Robert and 2 other men used ramps and a come-along winch to roll the Massey Ferguson off the trailer. It took 20 minutes. The tractor weighed so much. The flatbed suspension lifted 6 inches when it finally cleared the deck. Robert walked around the machine, checking fuel, oil, grease fittings, valve clearances. He moved slowly, methodically, like a man who'd done this 10,000 times. One of the deputies walked over. "You serious about this?" Robert didn't look up. "You got a better idea?" "We called for a rotator out of Bismarck. Should be here in 2 hours. 2 hours is a long time to block a highway. That tractor's 112 years old." "I know. You really think it can pull that truck? Robert straightened up. He looked at the deputy, then at the semi, then at the Massey Ferguson. I think it's got more torque than anything else you've got here. The deputy didn't argue. He just walked back to his cruiser and radioed that they were attempting an alternative recovery method. Robert climbed onto the tractor's platform. There was no seat, just a steel deck with foot pegs and a steering wheel mounted on a column. He primed the fuel system. He opened the compression release valves. He set the throttle. Then he grabbed the hand crank. It took 4 full rotations before the engine caught. When it did, the sound was like nothing most of the crowd had ever heard. Not a roar, not a hum, a deep, rhythmic thud-thud-thud-thud that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. The flywheel spun. The exposed crankshaft turned. The valve springs bounced. Smoke poured out of the exhaust stack in thick black clouds that smelled like kerosene and iron. Robert let it warm up for 5 minutes. Then he engaged the clutch and drove the Massey Ferguson forward, across the shoulder and onto the pavement. The crowd stepped back. The tractor moved at walking speed. The steel wheels had been fitted with flat pads to protect the road surface, but they still rang like hammers on an anvil with every rotation. The engine didn't speed up. It didn't slow down. It just kept firing. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3 strokes, 4, in perfect mechanical time. Robert stopped 20 feet in front of the semi. Eugene had already pulled the chains out of the flatbed, heavy-duty logging chains. Each link was 2 inches thick. Robert climbed down, hooked one end to the tractor's drawbar, and walked the other end forward to the semi's front axle. The transport driver was standing beside his truck, arms crossed. "This is a bad idea." Robert didn't answer. He just hooked the chain, checked the connection twice, and walked back to the tractor. One of the tow truck operators called out from the crowd, "You're going to snap that drawbar clean off." Robert climbed back onto the platform. Maybe. He engaged the clutch. The Massey Ferguson lurched forward. The chain went taut. The tractor's rear wheels dug into the pavement, and nothing happened. The semi didn't move. The crowd murmured. Someone laughed. The tow truck operator shook his head and turned away. Robert opened the throttle. The engine's rhythm deepened. The flywheel spun faster. The crankshaft turned with so much inertia that the entire frame of the tractor seemed to pulse with each stroke. The chain creaked. The semi's front tires shifted. Then, inch by inch, the entire rig started to move. The laughter stopped. The truck rolled forward, slowly. The trailer's wheels turned. The fighter jet shifted slightly on its cradle, but the straps held. The Massey Ferguson pulled steadily, the engine firing in perfect rhythm, the steel wheels biting into the pavement with every rotation. Robert didn't look back. He kept his eyes forward, one hand on the throttle, one hand on the steering wheel, his entire body leaning into the effort like he was willing the machine to keep pulling. The semi climbed 5 feet, then 10, then 20. The deputies were silent. The tow truck operators were silent. The entire crowd was silent. By the time the semi crested the top of the grade and rolled onto level pavement, the only sound was the Massey Ferguson's engine, still firing, still strong, still steady. Robert idled the tractor down, disengaged the clutch, and shut off the fuel. The engine coughed once, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Eugene walked up and unhooked the chain. The transport driver stood beside his truck, staring at the Massey Ferguson like it had just broken the laws of physics. One of the tow truck operators walked over to Robert. "What's the horsepower on that thing?" 40. 40 at the drawbar, 20 at the belt. That semi weighs 25 tons. I know. How the hell did you move it? Robert looked at him. Torque. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. Because by the time Robert got home that night, 3 people had already posted videos of the rescue online. Someone's dash cam had caught the whole thing. Another person had filmed it on their phone. By morning, the footage had been shared across every farming forum, equipment page, and tractor restoration group in North America. The comments were immediate. That's not possible. Fake. Had to be staged. No way a tractor from 1912 can pull that much weight. But the video didn't lie. The timestamps didn't lie. The county sheriff's report didn't lie. A 1912 Massey Ferguson tractor had pulled a semi-truck and a fighter jet up a 7% grade after 6 modern vehicles had failed. and Robert Callahan had been the one driving it. By the end of the week, he'd received calls from 4 museums, 2 documentary producers, an equipment collector in Sweden who offered him $85,000 for the tractor. Robert turned them all down, because the Massey Ferguson wasn't for sale. It never had been. 3 months later, a man named Victor Landry showed up at Robert's farm. Victor was 68. He owned 1,200 acres in eastern Montana. He ran a custom harvesting crew, and he'd spent the last 30 years telling anyone who'd listen that old equipment was a liability. He drove new combines, new trucks, new everything. He believed in horsepower, in computer diagnostics, in GPS guidance and yield monitors and precision ag technology that could calculate fuel efficiency down to the tenth of a gallon. He did not believe in Robert's Massey Ferguson, but he'd watched the video, and he had a problem. Victor's crew was contracted to harvest a section of winter wheat for a family trust that owned land near the Missouri River. The field was 640 acres, flat and easy to work, except for one corner where a vintage John Deere combine had broken down in 1987 and never been removed. The combine had sunk into the soil. Over the years, it had become part of the landscape. Grass grew through the cab. Rust had fused the axles to the frame. And now, 37 years later, the family trust wanted it gone. They tried to move it twice. The first time, a backhoe had ripped the bucket trying to lift it. The second time, a bulldozer had broken traction and slid sideways into a drainage ditch. The trust was ready to pay $12,000 to have it cut apart with torches and hauled out in pieces. Victor told them he knew someone who could move it whole. He drove to Robert's farm and made the offer in person. $5,000, 1 day's work. You bring the Massey Ferguson, we pull that combine out, and you go home. Robert was standing in his shop replacing a bearing on a grain auger. Why me? Because I watched what you did on Highway 34, and I think you can do it again. That was different. The semi had wheels. This combine doesn't. I know. You know how much drag that creates? I know. Robert set down his wrench. Why don't you use your own equipment? Victor looked at him for a long time before answering. Because I don't have anything that can do it. Robert agreed. Not because he needed the money. Not because he wanted to prove anything. But because he wanted to see if the Massey Ferguson could handle it. They scheduled the job for early November, after the wheat was off and before the ground froze. Victor arranged for a flatbed to haul the tractor out to the field. Robert spent 2 weeks going through the machine, checking every bearing, every gear, every valve spring. The day of the job, the weather was cold and clear. The field was dry. The combine sat in the northeast corner, half buried, listing to one side like a shipwreck. Victor's crew was already there, 6 men, 2 bulldozers on standby, a cutting torch rig in case the pull failed. Robert didn't acknowledge them. He just climbed onto the Massey Ferguson, started the engine, and drove across the field toward the combine. The tractor's steel wheels left deep tracks in the dirt. The engine's rhythm was steady. Smoke poured from the stack. When Robert reached the combine, he stopped, climbed down, and walked around it twice. The frame was sunk 8 inches into the soil. The rear axle was completely buried. The front wheels were locked. Rust had welded the entire machine into a single immovable mass. Victor walked over. "Can you do it?" Robert didn't answer right away. He knelt down, scraped dirt away from the axle, checked the frame rails, and studied the angle. Finally, he stood up. "I'll need chains and a choker bar." Victor's crew brought the equipment. Robert hooked the chains under the combine's frame, looped them through the choker bar, and connected everything to the Massey Ferguson's drawbar. Then he climbed back onto the platform. He opened the throttle halfway. The engine's rhythm deepened. The chain went taut. The Massey Ferguson's rear wheels dug into the dirt, and for the first time in 37 years the combine moved. It didn't roll, it dragged. The frame scraped across the dirt. The buried axle tore free from the soil. Roots snapped, rocks tumbled. The entire machine lurched forward 6 inches, then a foot, then 2 feet. Robert kept the throttle steady. The Massey Ferguson pulled without hesitation, the engine firing in perfect time, the drawbar holding, the chain creaking but never breaking. Victor's crew stood in silence. The bulldozer sat unused. By the time Robert had dragged the combine 50 yards across the field and onto solid ground, Every man on that crew understood what they were looking at. Not a museum piece, not a restoration project, a tool, a working, functional, unstoppable tool that had just done something their modern equipment couldn't. Victor paid Robert in cash that afternoon, $5,000, exactly as promised. But before Robert left, Victor asked him one question. Why didn't you ever sell it? Robert was standing beside the Massey Ferguson, wiping grease off the drawbar. Because my grandfather told me something when I was 12 years old. What? He said, never sell a machine that still works, because the day you need it, you won't be able to find another one. Victor nodded slowly. He was right. By January, the story had spread again. This time it wasn't just forums and Facebook pages. Agricultural equipment magazines picked it up. Tractor restoration clubs wrote articles. A Canadian documentary crew contacted Robert about filming a segment. He declined. But the attention didn't stop, because people wanted to know how a 112-year-old tractor could outperform modern recovery equipment, how a machine with 40 horsepower could move loads that required 10 times that much power on paper. The answer wasn't complicated. It was torque. The Massey Ferguson's engine produced 1,200 foot-pounds of torque at 300 RPM. That torque was delivered directly to the rear axle through a gear reduction system that multiplied it even further. The result was a drawbar pull capacity that exceeded 8,000 pounds at walking speed. Modern tractors produced more horsepower. But horsepower is a measurement of work over time. Torque is the rotational force that actually moves the load. And the Massey Ferguson had torque in abundance. But there was something else, something harder to quantify. The machine had been built to last. Every component, every gear, every bearing, every casting had been designed with a safety margin that modern engineers would consider wasteful. The crankshaft was twice as thick as it needed to be. The connecting rods were forged from solid steel. The frame was built from cast iron that could withstand impacts that would shatter modern alloys. It wasn't efficient by today's standards, but it was indestructible. And Robert had maintained it the way it was meant to be maintained. He didn't cut corners. He didn't use cheap parts. He didn't ignore maintenance schedules. He treated the Massey Ferguson like it mattered, because to him it did. In March, Robert received a letter. It was from a man named Thomas Millwood, the director of the Western Agricultural Equipment Museum in Calgary. The museum was planning a centennial exhibit on early tractor technology, and they wanted to feature Robert's Massey Ferguson as the centerpiece. The offer was generous. They'd pay for transport. They'd provide full insurance. They'd display the tractor for 6 months, then return it in the same condition. And they'd pay Robert $15,000 for the privilege. Robert read the letter twice. Then he set it on his desk and didn't respond. His wife found it a week later. You're not even going to consider it? No. It's $15,000. I know. Robert, that tractor just sits in the shed most of the year. It sits in the shed because it's ready. The day I need it, I don't want to be waiting for a museum to ship it back. She didn't argue. She knew better. But that night, she asked him a different question. What are you going to do with it when you're gone? Robert was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Your son doesn't want it. I know. He told me he's going to sell it the day you're not here to stop him. Robert looked at her. Then I'll make sure I'm here. 4 months later, Robert got another call. This time, it was from a farmer in South Dakota named Carl Hendricks. Carl was 81. He'd been farming the same land since 1962, and he was dying. Pancreatic cancer, 6 months, maybe less. He didn't call Robert to talk about illness. He called because he had a 1914 Massey Ferguson sitting in his barn, and he wanted to know if Robert could help him get it running one last time. Robert drove down the next day. Carl's tractor was in worse shape than Robert's had ever been. The engine was seized, the flywheel was cracked, the rear axle was bent, but Carl had kept every part, every bolt, every piece of the original machine. Robert spent 3 weeks working on it. He brought tools, he brought bearings, he brought knowledge that couldn't be written down in a manual. And on a Saturday morning in late July, he got the engine to fire. Carl was sitting in a lawn chair beside the barn when it happened. The sound of that 4-cylinder kerosene engine hitting its rhythm for the first time in 40 years brought tears to his eyes. Robert let it run for 10 minutes. Then he shut it down, climbed off the platform, and walked over to Carl. "It's ready," Carl nodded. "Thank you. You going to drive it?" "I can't." "Then why'd you want it running?" Carl looked at the tractor, then at Robert. "Because I wanted to hear it one more time before I go. I wanted to know it still worked, that it wasn't just junk." Robert understood, because that's what the Massey Ferguson had always been about. Not nostalgia, not history, proof that something built right could outlast everything. Carl died 6 weeks later. His family sold the farm, the equipment went to auction, but the 1914 Massey Ferguson didn't. Carl's will specified that it was to be given to Robert Callahan, free of charge, on the condition that he kept it running. Robert accepted. He hauled it home, parked it beside his own 1912 model, and spent the next year rebuilding it properly. Now he had two machines that had outlived their makers, two machines that still worked, two machines that proved the same thing Carl had wanted to prove, that some things don't break, they endure. By the time Robert turned 75, people had stopped asking him why he kept the Massey Fergusons. They'd seen what those machines could do. They'd watched the videos, they'd heard the stories. They knew that when modern equipment failed, Robert's tractors didn't, and they respected him for it. But Robert didn't do it for respect. He did it because his grandfather had been right. The day you need a machine, you won't be able to find another one. So you keep the one you've got, you maintain it, you rebuild it, you treat it like it matters, because someday it will, and when that day comes, you'll be ready.